Joining us now, Alan Young, professor, Osgoode Hall Law School, and the lawyer who represented 3 sex workers who challenged Canada's prostitution laws in Ontario Superior Court. And most unlike most of what you do, won.
Yeah, I don't deal well with success. It was a bit of a shock to me, though I must tell you, I always believed I had a very compelling argument. But courts are backwards looking. Their job really is to preserve status quo. You've really got to push them to do something like this, and I guess we drew the right judge. The argument was good, and she kept an open mind and realized that the laws are operating to the detriment of women.
Well, let's do the chronology. Sure. Let's go back. We're going to start with the background. Before last week's court ruling, what exactly was the legal status of prostitution in Canada?
Pretty much since 1892, you can sell sex, but there's a lot of activities that are prohibited. For example, communicating in a public place, moving indoors to a bawdy house, hiring people to help you. So those are the 3 areas that we attack, saying, well, if it's legal to sell sex, how can Parliament then take away your opportunities to do it in a safe way? And so there's lots of provisions. We left probably 20 prostitution-related offenses related to children and real pimps, and we just selected the ones that are really preventing street workers from improving their lot in life by moving indoors and maybe having some bodyguards or security.
So what laws, can you give me, for instance, what law in particular you would have challenged in this case?
It was communicating for purpose of prostitution in a public place, keeping a bawdy house for purpose of prostitution, and living on the avails of prostitution.
Okay. And what section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms do you believe was violated because of these laws?
It's Section 7, which is a grab bag that says everyone's entitled to life, liberty, security, not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with principles of fundamental justice. So we showed that their security and liberty was impaired because they're in danger, and it's not in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice because laws must not be arbitrary, must not be overbroad, or must not be grossly disproportionate in terms of combating their harm. We had accepted doctrines of fundamental justice from the Supreme Court of Canada that we just tied into this factual scenario, and that's why it works so well.
And the judge agreed with that?
Yeah, she's actually not breaking any new law, so this is going to be a little bit hard for the Crown to appeal this successfully to the higher court. She did nothing new. People may disagree with her perspective on the facts, but she was entitled to make those findings, and in my opinion, those were the only findings she could make based on the evidence.
And we should clarify, this was not trial by jury, this was not a panel of judges,
no.
This was one judge.
What happened was we were collecting evidence by affidavits from experts for about 2 years. We had 22 witnesses, they had 32. We do all the cross-examinations behind closed doors in front of a court reporter, and then we end up in front of Justice Himmel for a week with 88 volumes and hundreds of thousands of documentary pages of evidence. And surprisingly, it looks like she read all of it. She seemed very well informed when she wrote this. And I think we presented a very good case.
So what is the legal status of prostitution now that she has made her decision?
Well, nothing has changed immediately, but in 30 days what will happen will be that the police still will be able to enforce the laws on the street, but not as well. And women will now have the opportunity to move indoors. I'm not saying set up huge businesses, just one person, maybe 2 sex workers, moving indoors, locking the door, and working there. Also, you will be able now to hire people to provide services, whether it's drivers, bodyguards, receptionists. Before, the money was tainted. You could not take any money for services from sex trade workers. So you can see the law really sort of isolated them, said work on the street without any help, without moving indoors. That's really not a very fair and reasonable way to deal with anybody, especially when it's legal to do what they're doing.
Well, did you see your job in this case as to legitimize this activity?
No, not at all. No? Constitutional lawyers, we engage in demolition. That's all we do, is take down bad laws. Everyone's asking me, what's going to be next? I'm not the architect. I'm the demolition guy. I demolish the bad laws. Now it's really for Canadians and elected officials to decide what they want. I cast no judgments on this trade. Obviously, I'm not a person who thinks the law should be engaging in setting moral preferences. But I'm not telling Canadians what's good or bad for them or whether working in the sex trade is good or bad. Those are decisions people will make. I just wanted to remove laws that really harm sex workers.
So are you happy to have Parliament make some new laws in this area?
No, yes and no. We had to go to court because Parliament would not deal with it for the last 30 years. They kept saying they would. So having an invalidation triggers the need for them to deal with it. I hope it comes about at a time when this government's not in power, because I'm afraid they may move backwards and become more repressive to address the decision by saying, well, we outlaw everything, so the arbitrariness is gone. It would be a very bad decision for Canadians, but it's something I can see this government doing. So we're probably talking a couple of years of appeal, 2 years, and who knows who will be in power at the time. But if this decision is upheld, Parliament has to act, unless they want to leave it as a huge gray area, and that's not good for anybody, quite frankly.
So would you be happier if Parliament passed a new law essentially legalizing everything the judge said in her decision?
Probably, because I think that's the right way to go, and internationally that's what's happening in the Commonwealth and in Germany. And so far, the results of these programs have been fairly good in terms of improving occupational health and safety. They're not panaceas. There's a huge socio-political problem related to poverty and prostitution and survival sex work. That's not going to go away with this ruling, but if we can protect a few women, if Picton could not get to 26, only get to 20, then we've done our job.
And just so I understand the distinction, decriminalizing or legalizing, which is your preference?
Decriminalizing is really a non-existent state. It just means the criminal law doesn't apply, but it's a vacuum. You can't leave this industry unregulated. It's a business that has to be regulated because there's intimacy, physical intimacy, so there has to be some rules and regulations about how this business is conducted. Decriminalization is the first step towards legalization, but it really is just a vacuum.
Now you said, at least I think you said, that you didn't like these laws because you thought these laws put sex workers in danger. What is the evidence of that?
Well, the evidence is basically that we know it's very dangerous on the streets, and we know that there's predatory criminals trolling the streets looking for street workers. We also know from international studies that the incidence of violence is never eliminated, but it's significantly reduced indoors. They do studies of brothel workers versus street workers. It's kind of common sense, actually. We had a lot of empirical data to support it, but it makes sense that if you can go behind a door that you lock and you have a security guard and a receptionist to screen your clients, you should be safer than jumping into a car on a dark street corner.
It's common sense, but do you not have to bring forward evidence from other jurisdictions around
That's
the
why
world?
we had 22 witnesses. I wanted to do this case based on common sense, and I could have had this ruling about 2 years ago, but I was afraid in asking a judge to invalidate laws that would be long-standing. If I didn't show up with some evidence, he or she may balk at the claim. So we actually did overkill on the evidence. I thought none of it was necessary, and one of the first things I told the judge when I showed up said, there's 88 volumes here. You probably don't have to read many of them because it's mainly irrelevant about issues about age of entry, drug addiction. That's not my case. My case is about safety on the street versus indoors. It's a matter of common sense. There's a little bit of evidence to support it. All the other things the Crown is saying about trafficked women and child prostitution is irrelevant to my case.
Do you know Benjamin Perrin, the UBC law prof?
I've heard the name.
Okay. He did an op-ed piece in the Globe and Mail about this. I want to read you a little excerpt because he's studied it in other jurisdictions around the world. In 1999, Sweden took a pioneering approach. Rather than punish those who are sold for sex, the country holds the purchasers of sex acts liable. The government also implemented a $32 million national action plan that helps those who are being sold for sex to obtain assistance to exit their exploitation. The Swedish model recognizes that there is an undeniable link between human trafficking for sexual exploitation and prostitution. The evidence is that the Swedish model is working. Between 1999 and 2003, the number of women being sold for sex in the country dropped by 40%. Do you think the Swedish model is appropriate here?
No, no. It's a transaction between two people. You don't demonize one side of the transaction. I think they're right to say women are more the victims in this, but to say the Johns are evil and predatory and must be punished, I think that's just an ideological position that's somewhat nonsense. Sweden is not the model. They never had a big problem with the sex trade. In the 60s, we all knew Sweden is the land of free sex. That means prostitution and the sex trade is minimized in a country like that. Plus, they don't even have a problem really with trafficking because they're a very homogeneous society, unlike our society. They decided this for ideological reasons. The radical feminists convinced them that this is the right symbolic politics. I don't engage in symbolic politics. I engage in practical politics, and we can't simply demonize the Johns and say the problem's solved. It'll solve nothing, actually.
Do you think illness is a victimless crime?
Yes, except that I do believe a lot of people in the sex trade are victims of their own circumstances and would not be willingly in the sex trade if they had options. So there's no question we have to help women exit. But I also know there's lots of women who make autonomous, independent decisions to make some money doing this. And I have students who put themselves through college and university doing this.
How do you know that?
Because they tell me, because they know I'm not going to judge them for that.
You have students come up to you and say,
yes,
I'm helping pay my way through law school
No question. I've known that in undergraduate, when I taught undergraduate courses, and in law school. classes, it has a pretty easy way to make good money.
If it's safe.
If it's safe. And most of these people have the education and wherewithal not to be working the streets. They work indoors, and they use the digital revolution to basically get their advertising out. So they can do it in a very safe way. And I know there are ways to do it safely. And all I'm trying to do is open up the law to allow women that choice, knowing there's lots of women who are being victimized on the streets that Parliament and social welfare agencies have to do something about.
Even a guy who's as libertarian as you are, though, can't think this is a great way to make a living. Would you agree?
I wouldn't want to make a living doing this, but I also wouldn't want to clean toilets in a hotel. I mean, there's a lot of really degrading jobs. I think this job can potentially be very demeaning and degrading. I also think it can be empowering. My mantra in court was the diversity of life forms on this planet is enormous. And if you are saying there's one stereotypical image of the prostitute as that crack-addicted whore on the street, you're missing the point. There's all different types. And my case is more really about the independent, intelligent ones that can take these options. Whether they're 2%, 5%, or 50% of the profession, I have no idea. But law cannot put people in harm's way. It defeats the whole point of law, and that's why we had to clean this up.
One of your clients is particularly good.
Colorful.
Yeah, colorful is a good way to put it. Terry Jean.
Yeah.
She's the dominatrix, right? She's also got a history, right? She was 16. She met an abusive 37-year-old drug dealer, addict, sold her to feed both of their addictions. How do you separate the prostitution from the sort of coercive human trafficking angle in all of this?
Well, Terry's is actually a good story because when she was working the streets, she was oppressed. But when she became a dominatrix and she moved indoors to her dungeon and she had receptionists and security, she felt safe. And oddly enough, that's when she got busted for keeping a bawdy house. When she finally reached a level in her profession where she could take care of herself and offer her services with integrity and safety, they still took her down and called her a prostitute running a bawdy house. So she's the living example of how moving indoors is the way to go if you care at all about the safety and security of women in this business.
And she doesn't actually have sex with her clients, does she?
No, no. Being a dominatrix, it would be a contradiction to give them pleasure. You've got to oppress them and humiliate them. It's all about pain and humiliation. That's a different form of sex. That'd be another show, I guess.
Okay, we'll save that for another day. Let's talk about what happens now. The Ontario General of Ontario, I think the Minister of Justice federally, both not crazy about the decision. Both
knee-jerk reaction to appeal.
Yeah.
If they cared about women, they wouldn't appeal. They'd say, we understand this judgment. We'll go back to the drawing board, as we said we would in 1985, to fix this. Their knee-jerk reaction to appeal this and hope a court overturns it shows they actually don't care, and that's what I've suspected over 30 years. In 1985, when John Crosby introduced the communication bill, he told the Senate and House of Commons, I know this is flawed legislation. I'm coming back with a comprehensive package. 1985. And then they kept having task forces say, your law's not working, it's hurting people. Oh, well.
You know, the two politicians in this case, though, both say that they're doing it because of their support for women.
I know.
So are you negotiating with them behind the scenes to find some resolution to this?
No, I'm not going to convince them. There's a lot of ideological positions that motivate people's thinking. I'm just sticking to the safety issue and the constitutional law and not trying to address these bigger issues. I'll let greater minds think about this. But reasonable people are going to disagree on what's right or wrong about this.
They got a month to appeal, though, right? And if they decide they are going full speed ahead...
They are going ahead with appeal. The question is whether they lose the law in the interim. Right now, the laws remained intact because the judgment stayed. In 30 days, that stay lapses. They have to extend it. I may consent to it continuing if they will have this appeal launch very quickly, because that's my interest, to get a high court resolving this for all of Canada. So they can have their law for a few months if they feel it's necessary, but I haven't heard back yet from the court or from them as to whether we get an early date. So if we can't get an early date, I'm fighting vigorously not to have this law in place because a judge made a finding it's harming women. You can't have a law continue when you've had a finding that is hurting people.
Okay, one last thing,
Sure.
and that is, you know, this is a very insurgent business to begin with, right? This is a business that happens, you know, away from the cameras, and
Sure.
it's private, it's quiet, it's, you know, all of that. But it sounds like you think that it ought to be brought into the daylight insofar as we need government to regulate it, we need healthcare standards, we need, you know, who knows, pensions for
No question.
sex, the whole 9 yards? Is that, do you
No
think that's
question about it. A
reasonable to
lot
happen?
of the abuses will be curtailed when you make it above board. Let me give you an example. The only people now who will be managers in bawdy houses are criminals. Who else would choose? A legitimate business person with integrity is not going to engage in illegal activity. Once it becomes legal and regulated, good people will start moving in, hopefully, and you'll have better employee relations and employers who actually treat sex workers with some degree of respect. In 50 years or 2 generations, we may actually lose that stigma, which really was drawn of religion, that surrounds the sex trade.
I was going to say, can you imagine any government picking this up and saying, yes, we actually need to do something about that? That's a government that's prepared to write off a whole lot of votes, I think.
Oh, no question about it, but if they have to protect safety, they have to protect safety. If they're not going to do it, they'll lose the law. They have to choose what they want to do here, and I think the first order of business is protecting people in the trade. If they feel that Canadians want to eradicate prostitution, which will never happen, they can go back to the drawing board and come up with a more punitive regime. But I'll tell you, moving backwards never really solves very much. You got to sometimes look forward. We've tried the repressive regimes before, they haven't worked. It's time for a bit of novel thinking in Parliament. That's a pretty tall order.
Okay, Alan, thanks for coming into TVO
My
tonight
pleasure.
and telling us about it. Appreciate it.
Sure.